Hello, I am Muchaneta Napel, and this is Fashion Politics. Um, I'm one of those people that, I'm really big on following people that have something to educate me on. I'm always learning, and I'm really big on that. So recently, I met somebody on LinkedIn called Hilary Jochman. And I don't know if you don't know who she is, why are you not following her? She is somebody that has been really talking a lot about the intersection of fashion and public policy. And as most of you know, right now the fashion industry is undergoing significant changes. And we have reached a critical point, guys, where understanding legislation and all these kind of rules and laws that are coming into play, especially in the EU, has become essential. And it's a brand's responsibility to really enter this space with the kind of knowledge that will help them come out at the other end. So today we're going to touch on a lot of that kind of stuff, that kind of intersection of fashion and policy and so forth. And I'm looking forward to having the conversation with Hilary. Hilary, thank you so much for joining us. How are you today?
I'm well. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm honored.
Hilary's joining us all the way from DC, and I'm here in Amsterdam. So I'm really, really excited to talk to her and for her finding that time in her very busy schedule to have a chat with us. So let's dive straight in, because I know you're the founder of Politically in Fashion.
Yes.
I love that title, by the way. Tell me, what urged you to start it in the first place?
I started it, interestingly enough, right before the start of the pandemic, but it's something I had been developing in my mind for several years before then. And it really grew out of a need that I saw from a personal perspective. By way of background, I am in Washington, D.C. I'm a government affairs consultant, and I had spent many years working in politics in New York and Washington. And I had a real love, personally and professionally, of fashion. And I wanted to find a way to marry these two interests of mine, both the politics and policy part, as well as the fashion as a economic driver, as an industry, as a mode of creative expression. It was like, where can I find a community to discuss all these issues? And after many years of searching, I realized there was not that kind of space. And I felt there was a need for it. I thought if I was interested in that, I was pretty sure there were some other people out there as well. So that's why I developed Politically in Fashion, and we launched in February of 2020, which was an auspicious time to launch, but also the start of a lot of new policy issues for discussion. And we've been rolling ever since, and it's been a great experience so far.
I love the fact that you are not officially from the fashion industry, because I feel like a lot of people that are, especially in the recent years, that are entering fashion are coming from another industry. Like when you think of material science, a lot of them are actually scientists and engineers who are coming into the industry and I guess showing them the way a little bit. Who would you say, because you kind of merge in these two industries, who would you say is your audience at the moment?
Well, really, we're designed to be a community engagement platform for everyone from designers, manufacturers, retailers, reporters in this area, lawyers in this area, as well as students and consumers. So really, we try to provide an opportunity to have access to policy information for wherever you are in the economy.
When it comes to making environmental claims, what companies think their green claims mean and what consumers really understand are two very different things. And this is where the Federal Trade Commission's green guides have stepped in. To those who don't know what these green guides are about, could you elaborate a little bit and explain what they mean, why they exist, and who are they meant for?
Sure. So the green guides are guides that were put out by the Federal Trade Commission here in the US, the FTC. They were first promulgated in 1992, and they are designed to help businesses to make lawful claims about the environmental aspects of their products. And it's also to help consumers understand these claims. They've been updated periodically since 1992, but the most recent updates have not occurred since 2012. And we all know a lot has happened in these past 11 years, both in terms of technology as well as consumer interest and awareness in these areas. So Politically in Fashion led a call to action back in 2021, asking the FTC to please begin the review process of these guides to update them. And we were very pleased to see that they announced they would be beginning the review process in 2022. It started sort of right under the wire. The announcement came out early December of 2022, but they are now undergoing this comprehensive review of the guides. And as a rulemaking process develops here in the US, this does take quite a while. So I'd expect it to be a multi-year process, but we're glad to see that it is starting so that these guides are actually meaningful and are impactful to individuals as well as businesses.
I find it interesting that you said that these green guides that are being produced are also being focused on not just on businesses, but also on consumers.
Right.
Because I know that over here we have the EU Greenwashing Directive, which is a guide to help companies not to greenwash and to know basically what they should and shouldn't put on labels and so forth. But a lot of that information is not actually for consumers. It's mainly just for businesses.
Well, I would
So
say both. Yeah, for here, it's definitely for consumers as well as businesses. And actually, the FTC, their whole purpose is to help prevent fraud and misinformation throughout all sorts of sectors in the US. I mean, they happen to, right now we're focusing on the green guides, but they are engaged in all sorts of other consumer protection areas. So it's very interesting to see that this is sort of the lead agency in the US looking at these issues. I would make it analogous to what happens in the UK, their principles, but very different from what the EU has done, which I'd
indeed.
say specific, really enforcing what is acceptable action. Whereas here, we're talking more about the marketing of those actions, right? So we're not saying you have to be environmentally friendly or do anything that's sustainable or sound. You can be as unfriendly to the environment as you want right now under the rules. But if you're going to claim that you're doing something positive, you have to be able to back it up, and it's got to be made in a way that the average consumer can understand what that claim is.
When it comes to that word sustainable, what is the Green Guide's definition of it?
Which actually right now the Green Guides does not touch on the word sustainable. In 2012, the FTC said, we just don't have enough information to opine on sustainable, so we're not going to touch it. And so in the absence of definitions, or even as we've been advocating for, some sort of guardrails on the term, it's really easy to say something is sustainable. And it's also really easy to say, no, something's not sustainable. So yes, I think there is a desire from many folks in the industry to have some sort of a level playing field and an understanding of what the terminology is, what's acceptable to use.
That is quite frustrating because I think it's so important for us to have a standard definition of that word sustainability. Not only will it level out the playing field, it will just make it much more easier for brands to be more transparent. I mean, you only have to look on social media and realize that the hashtag sustainable fashion has been used 16.5 billion times on Instagram. And I must admit, I'm guilty of posting and using that hashtag myself. And then there's 2.9 billion minutes have been spent watching videos on TikTok using the hashtag sustainable fashion. Then you think about the sustainable fashion events, the consultants, the college courses, job descriptions. And yet there is no clear industry accepted definition of what sustainability means. It is no wonder brands are making claims willy-nilly.
Any brand that you see now, they're all making claims on their sustainability or whatever the new buzzword is, right? Regenerative, traceability, organic, things like that. And without a more comprehensive understanding of what these terms mean, it's very challenging for consumers. And I think that's the angle the FTC is going to go at with this, because their mission is to protect consumers. And if consumers keep seeing the word sustainable, thrown around, and you look at something and you think, really, that's sustainable? I don't know. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. It's just too much effort. I'm not even going to worry about this. I'm just going to buy what I'm going to buy. And I think we're at that tipping point right now where we either start to have these words mean something or just accept that's gone.
Are there any penalties for non-compliance? I'm just curious.
It's interesting. Right now, there's not a private right of action. The FTC has discretion as to whether or not to bring charges. There have been a few court cases, both nationally or in some states. California has had a few cases on this. The FTC issues warning letters, but it has not been enforced, I think, to the extent that it could be. Now, there are various reasons why that might be. It could be, because there's lack of definitions on what to enforce. The FTC is a very busy federal agency that is perennially underfunded and understaffed. And so they face a lot of internal challenges on how they can move forward with their mission.
2023 seems to be the year that legislation has come for fashion. It has found a way of ending, I guess, fashion's history of self-reporting and sets its sight on making an impact where brands have failed to do so. So I can imagine that a lot of companies might be coming to you for assistance. Has this been happening? Are you in demand, Hilary?
There has definitely been an increased interest in public policy discussions from the industry. And it's a really fascinating industry to work with because, you think about even your, quote, big brands, multinational brands, most of them still have very lean teams, right? So they don't have the bandwidth to have somebody or a team of people looking at public policy issues full time. And historically, this has not been an industry in the US that has been particularly regulated. And you contrast that to something like financial services or the healthcare industry or the energy industry, where they have been regulated very extensively by the government and therefore have policy people in-house who work on these issues. So there has been an increased interest from brands, from consumers, from thought leaders and advocates to think about, first of all, to understand what the political process is, right? Because we've got one process nationally here in the US. We've also got 50 states that have their own political processes. And of course, these are brands that are also operating in Europe or the UK or Australia. They've got a whole other set of policies and regime structure to look at. So it can be very challenging. And then to have the discussion on what are the policies that are currently out there, what are policy makers thinking when they're looking at developing legislation, because there's also a learning curve on that side, right? I mean, these are policymakers who have not focused on a lot of these issues in the past. So there's education on both sides. So one of the things we try to do with Politically in Fashion, because I do come from a government background, is to bring everyone together to have those discussions, because you want to have I advocate that you should have a seat at the table as business. If someone is going to be talking about you, why don't you want to be there?
I agree.
And giving your views, and for the policymakers to understand how the business works, because you can have the best of intentions, but at the end of the day, sometimes you just can't make a square peg fit in a round hole, and you've got to talk about, okay, how do we all have the same end goal, but how do we logistically make this work?
I could not agree with you more, Hilary, especially when you pointed out that if someone is going to be talking about you, why wouldn't you want a seat at the table? We as an industry basically have the insider knowledge to help policymakers better understand how the business works. But I think the problem is, Hilary, that the fashion industry doesn't really know how to get that seat at the table. There is really no clear path.
Right. And I think in the past, especially in the US, they haven't had to engage because there hasn't been a lot of regulation in this area. And there are some folks who feel that maybe that can just continue. But I think those days are over. You have an electorate, the consumers, who are very focused on this, who want to vote with their pocketbook on how they spend their money on fashion choices. You have elected representatives at the national and at the state and the city level who are focused on environmental issues, labor issues, all those types of things that are particularly impactful to the fashion industry. So, people want to have this discussion. So I think the days of sort of putting your head in the sand and saying, no, we can self-regulate, government's not going to touch us. I think those days are numbered.
I
And
agree.
I advise people to have that seat at the table. And, you know, we focus a lot on sort of the sustainability and environmental issues, which are very important to the industry. But I also encourage the industry to think about all the other legislative and policy issues that impact the business. Because let's remember, fashion is an industry. It's not something that's just, you know, fun and frilly and
Indeed.
an industry. It is an economic driver. It employs many people around the world, many women around the world. So these are women's issues. These are immigration issues. These are trade issues. They're labor issues, foreign policy issues. You know, all these types of things that the industry should be engaged on, in addition to the sustainability and environmental parts.
You made a strong point there, because it is an industry that when people think of fashion, they think of Devil Wears Prada. They think of
Right.
frilliness. They think of, you know, they don't really think like what you said, that it's an industry that employs a lot of women, both in the West and also in other parts of the world, that rely on that money, you know. It's an industry that is really big in places like Bangladesh, where manufacturing. So it's very global.
Right.
And I think it's going to be very hard to tame that monster that is this industry. You know, it's not something that you can put a law in place and everything will be all right with the world. I really feel like it's something where we're going to have to give brands enough time to understand what these legal implications mean and how they can kind of like, I guess, comply to what they need to.
That's one of the reasons I encourage brands to engage in this conversation now, and
Mhm.
you know, for the activists as well, to understand that, you know, as much as we may want to flip a switch and have something happen right away, sometimes we just can't.
No.
You know, supply chain issues, things are built out a certain way. I want to see people come to the table in good faith and work out how we can make changes happen. Like, for example, I'm a big proponent of domestic manufacturing. I've worked with Save the Garment Center in New York. But, you know, unfortunately, in the United States, we gave up a lot of our capacity for domestic manufacturing, both in terms of machinery and well as people skills 50 years ago. And we cannot just flip a switch and say, okay, we're going to produce everything onshore again. We've got to shore up our factories. We've got to train people. We've got to get the raw materials here, all those types of things. So it's a bit of a process to have happen, worth exploring, but understanding that it's going to take time, and that's okay.
I would like to move on to recycling of textile waste. This is a quite sore topic for some, a progressive topic for others. It's an area where legislation promises to play a role in helping companies be more accountable for their products, which makes sense because globally, only 12% of the material used in clothing ends up recycled. That means 88% is not recycled, quite a huge number if you compare it to paper, glass, and plastic PET bottles, which have recycling rates of 66% for paper, 27% for glass, and 29% for plastic PET bottles, which is a very clear message that the clothing industry is severely lagging behind. So that being said, I would love to hear what your thoughts are when it comes to recycling textile waste. How can the fashion industry improve its numbers?
So it's interesting for recycling here in the US. Recycling standards are included in the Green Guide. So let me talk about it from that perspective for a minute.
Okay.
When the FTC put out their notice that they were going to be updating the Green Guides, they highlighted a couple of things that said, we're really going to focus on these. We're going to look at all of them, but there are a few things we're really going to focus on. One of the first ones was recycling. And so they actually just held a workshop here in DC a couple of weeks ago to talk about recycling, which is great. But it was 100% focused on plastics. There was no discussion of textiles. So Politically in Fashion led a letter with others to the FTC urging them to please include textiles in this discussion. You know, for all the reasons you can imagine, this has to be talked about. And states here in the US are starting to develop their own processes for dealing with recycling. You have like Massachusetts that has laws on the books that basically is to help consumers recycle, right? So they've got more information about where you can do drop-offs and pickup and things like that for textiles and mattresses and things like that. And then you also have a state like California that's looking at it more the EPR, putting the responsibility on the producers. So the textile producers, so fashion companies, would have to bear the cost of doing the recycling from their consumers on the back end. So two very different ways of looking at textile recycling. Mm-hmm. And I'm not going to take a position on one or the other, but we have to have this conversation, I think, particularly at the national level, to develop some sort of standards and think about what's the right way to proceed. Because, at the end of the day, we have a lot of material to recycle. We right? Have to be able to figure out a way to safely do that. And there are all kinds of innovative programs out there, right, in terms of the recycling, but also brands that are doing take-back programs, more focus on the repair of items, focus on buying quality to begin with so that your items will last longer. But we also have to recognize at the end of the day, no matter how well it's made, no matter how good a job we do of taking care of it, at some point, it's going to have an end of life situation. And what do we do with the textiles at that point?
To be quite frank, Hilary, I think when it comes to brands and customers better understanding the end of life of their product and whether they should be recycling it or not, this is when technology needs to step in. And when I say technology, I am talking about the digital product passport. The good news is that when it comes to the DPP, the European Commission is actually planning to introduce it, and fingers crossed by 2026, they also plan to implement it for the first product groups.
Yeah, I haven't heard of it as a sort of a national standard. I know individual brands doing similar type things, like on a tag or on their website where they talk about, like, for example, the brand Amindi does this. They talk about what materials were used, where they came from, the processes that were used to manufacture them. I think they even get into some of the labor issues for how the clothes were manufactured. But that's all voluntary.
I think that on this side of the pond, the digital product passport is actually going to be mandatory and not voluntary. Experts have said that the DPP that will be introduced will probably be a much more basic version that will be focusing a lot more on manufacturing and recyclability. So to that I say roll on 2026. I'm super excited to see what will happen when this DPP comes into play. Because to be quite honest, I find that when it comes to laws being passed, it takes forever for anything to come through. And it's quite nice to be able to see something like the DPP being pushed and being kind of like forcing action within the fashion industry.
Right. I mean, I think there is a case to be made that it needs to happen quicker. But because there's a lack of education, I think, on the part of a lot of the elected officials in this area, yes. I caution about rushing things too much, because we've got to make sure that they understand the impact of what they legislate. I don't think a good solution is passing a bill tomorrow that doesn't work. So there's a case to be made for progressing at a steady pace, but that does not mean put your head in the sand and try to run out the clock, which is what I think we've seen happening a lot.
What advice would you give fashion brands if they're listening to what you're saying and they say, do you know what, actually, I know nothing about this, but I really want to get involved? What advice would you give them?
To engage now, identify who your elected representative is, whether it be locally, maybe like your city council person, or your state representative, or your national representative, so your congressional or your senator, and let them know what's important to you. As if you're an employer in their district, these elected representatives want to know what the impact of their actions will be on business. At the end of the day, so often the conversation, regardless of the subject, comes down to jobs. Will this add to jobs? Will this take away jobs in my district? And if you can have that conversation in those terms, I think that is extremely helpful. I think it can be very intimidating to go in and try to set up these meetings, but it shouldn't be. They are there to listen to what people in their district think and care about. I have worked in those offices myself. I have taken those calls. I have taken those meetings. I have advised the elected representatives on these issues. So I'm speaking from experience here that yes, this kind of engagement does make a difference. And look for other allies, other brands that think like you or have these same kinds of concerns. Reach out to them, have a conversation, and always shoot me an email, and I'm happy to talk more about the process and think about what would be right for you in terms of next steps.
And to those brands that are not taking this all very seriously?
They should. They should. I mean, officials are going to be more likely to engage on the subject when they see some agreement within the communities impacted by these bills. They don't need to come in and referee everybody here. They're going to be happy to see, okay, these folks are in this camp, these folks are in this camp. This is how we're going to move forward. And I really encourage people to come to the discussion with an open mind, and also with the idea of trusting the other people at the table, that we are all trying to make the right decisions here and come with a positive attitude to make this a successful venture. Otherwise, we're not going to make any good progress.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, was Hilary Jochmans. Thank you so much for finding the time to come and talk to me, to educate me. I look forward to us continuing this conversation again at some point. Thank you, Hilary.
Thank you so much. It was great to connect, and let me know if you're ever on the stateside here.
Will do. Thank you, Hilary.
Thank you.